Yeah, questions coming in right now. So Wes has a question. Do you wait until everything is tracked before applying the processing on the master fader, or do you record through it?
I'm not too fussy. I've done it enough times to not... I don't know, it depends. If there's a client there, then I will generally have some processing on the master bus so that they're hearing something that sounds really polished. If I'm tracking something for myself, I don't really care. I'll do weird things like just track my guitars to a repeating kick and snare, just going do-ga, 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 instead of a click track. And I would never do that with a client, but there's certain things which, if it's just me, I don't mind hearing those things if it's going to help me not have to care about that aspect of the process. Limiters, generally, like the really good ones, add some amount of latency, and even with latency compensation, I find that it can get really tricky sometimes tracking into sessions with those. Generally, anything really intensive on the master bus can really slow your computer down, so if that's a problem, I'll scrap it. But I generally tell, if the client is something like, whoa, what's going on, I'll say, don't worry, like, this is just so that you have really low latency while you're tracking.
Mm-hmm. Can you just quickly define what saturation generally is, regardless of whether it's analog or digital?
Just distortion, basically. And what distortion is where you're clipping the peaks off a signal. So something that was, say, a sine wave is like a really nice smooth wave like that. By the time it's been distorted, you're basically just going to flatten out the top and bottom. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because the particular device will have a very particular way of doing it. It won't just be like a completely flat cut, and that's where the different harmonic character comes from. But you'll see later when we get to one of the bass tracks that I've distorted, you can compare it to the DI, which is right above it. In fact, why not? We'll do it right now. Just visually, you can see during the kind of, the bit in 7 here, the kind of stonery riff. This is my DI'd bass guitar for that part. On this track here. I'll show you what that sounds like. It's running through all the processing as well. This is that same track run through a Darkglass B7K distortion pedal maxed out. And as you can see, there is literally no information there. It is a complete square. That is distortion taken to an absolute extreme. And if you listen to that, as the title of the track says, it's pretty filthy. Surprisingly, you can still kind of, even though it looks like that, you can tell it's a bass guitar. There is some information in there. This is also running through the pedal here, this part over here. You can see compared to that, it has been flattened out. So there's a visual representation of what distortion is doing to a signal. Those are literally the same signals. I recorded it DI and then reamped it through the pedal later.
Tom wants to know, Nolly, do you typically run multiple buses or do you prefer fewer? If you are running multiple buses, are you running your plugins from the buses or on the particular tracks?
We'll get into mixing all of the tracks later, but generally it's a combination. And if you look, just so that you can see quickly, you can see these drums, these green channels. I have all the kick mics, some to go through this capitalized, so we know it's a bus up here that says kick, and then same for the snare, the toms, the cymbals, which is all the spot mics and overheads. The mono room is all on its lonesome, and then we have the stereo rooms down here. Same thing for the bass. You can see I've got individual channels there, and then the kind of master bass bus there. Depending on what it is, there might not be anything on the individual track. It might just be processed alongside other things, but sometimes a specific sound is required, or there's a fault within the track, a resonance or something that I want to cut out before I combine it with something else. So it really depends, but I like, if I can, to treat things on buses. I like to see fewer plugins on my mixer. Sometimes it's not appropriate, but yeah.
Joe Jones wants to know, is there any reason you'd use the bus compressor to duck the signal instead of doing sidechain compression? Does it sound different if you do it that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of achieving the same result. I don't know what the sidechain... The thing is, the snare, if you saw the waveform of the whole mix with no master bus processing on it, the snare is going to be poking out like this much on either side. It's by far the biggest transient out of anything. So you've got so much headroom there for the compressor to see that there's not really a need to sidechain it. you could, but I don't think you'd really get any difference in sound. It's an interesting idea. You can try it, but yeah, I've never run into a problem where the snare is not getting enough. You know, there isn't enough snare for the compressor to act on it without being triggered by other things.
Does Nolly keep the limiter on when sending the mixes off to be mastered?
I do not. I do not. That always comes off. I have it there to be able to get the balance correct, but that's the one thing that I take off when I send it to mastering.
Okay. Alex wants to know, you mentioned that you deliberately made the Periphery Juggernaut mixes a bit dark. Do you change your 2-bus EQ with that in mind, or just mix each source differently?
No, that mix all ran through basically what you just saw there, a couple of older iterations of some of those plugins because they hadn't come out at the time. But, you know, you can still, if you don't boost high end on anything, it's still probably going to be a little bit darker than most commercial mixes. And also the darkness of that record came from almost the opposite end of the spectrum, really enforcing the low mids and the lows. And the cymbals are also quite quiet in the mix, and they're what's really contributing the top end information. So it's not so much EQ in the top end, but reduction of the elements that have a lot of top end, and then an increase in the stuff at the other end of the spectrum.
Do you still use the metric halo channel strip compressor
Yep.
on the snare kit?
It's on the kick drum in this mix, and we will get to that, but
Okay.
I think that's the one instance of it in this mix.
Okay.
We'll talk about it more later, but I like it because the gate seems to work really well for kick drums. And again, if I can have less plugins on there, then I'm happier. So on the snare, I found some things which I like more, or maybe I'm just seeking a change just because we're humans and generally like to change things up. But this compressor actually just came out a couple of days ago. It's the version 2 of the compressor that this company made, and I tried it in the hotel room last night after the tracking session and thought it sounded great, so it's on the mix.
Cool.
So we'll get into that later.
Kieran wants to know, could you explain what side chaining is? I always see it on some of my plugins, but I'm too afraid to use it. I know it links another bus, but for what purpose?
Yeah,
So without getting too far into it, just
yeah, no,
explain the concept.
It's kind of, I'm trying to think of like the really good way to explain it. If you imagine that if there's an internal sidechain in a plugin, what that means is that within the plugin, it is duplicating the signal, applying some kind of processing to that signal, generally filtering, so maybe EQing away low end and top end, or applying a boost somewhere in the mid-range or something. And then it's looking at that and reacting to that, but the actual compression, what's coming out of it is being applied to the original source signal. And you never hear the version that it's hearing. It's a really powerful tool. You can also do things with external sidechaining where basically you're the one providing what it's listening to. And in that case, it doesn't have to be a duplicate of the signal. It could be, as we were discussing earlier, just the snare drum or something. Or you could, I mean, it might not even be something that's present in the mix. You could sidechain, you know, if you didn't have, I'm trying to think of like a weird thing you could do. Maybe you could use the click track muted, but at the same time being muted for the monitors, but being sent to a compressor and triggering the compressor every time the click occurs. You never hear it, but you hear the effect of that on the track that you've got the compressor put on. It can also be, yeah, it can be really useful for, let's say, if you've got a noise gate, for honing in on the exact frequencies that you want that gate to work on. Let's say you have the kick drum has a lot more low-end energy than, say, the cymbals and the snare that might be leaking into that microphone. If we want to really effectively gate that, we could tell the gate to just look at the low end of the kick, and we'd be using the sidechain for that, because there's so much less kind of crosstalk coming from those other signals into it. So that would be a really good use of a sidechain, an internal sidechain within a gate.
Nolly, do you use any stereo widening plugins, or do you rely more on panning combined with compression EQ to create natural space in the mix?
Very rarely. I use it a little bit on rhythm guitars, which we'll get to. I do plenty of mixes where I don't use any of it. Generally, I try to not use too many artificial widening plugins. Sometimes they have a really noticeable sound, which is cool and works really well in certain contexts, but sometimes it's, I don't know, it's almost like hearing it's not as bad, but it's almost like hearing artifacts of auto-tune on a vocalist or something, sometimes. I do sometimes use it if someone sent me a stereo source that's just way too narrow. I had a session recently where the engineer who tracked some drums opted to use a stereo microphone, which basically was set up very much like the mics we had in front of the kit yesterday, the small diaphragm condensers and an A/B configuration. And that really doesn't give a very wide image. And this was for the overhead of the drums, and I felt like the cymbals were all in the middle here. And that might be cool for another style of music, but for metal and rock, I like to hear really extreme panning of the cymbals. I like to hear it kind of filling the whole stereo space. And on that occasion, I did use a stereo widener to try and artificially create that.
Awesome. Do you use linear phase EQ ever?
Rarely.
Okay.
And there is a really, really, really good tutorial about it made. I sound like I'm sponsored by this company, but I'm not. I wish I was. FabFilter have an amazing series. Every plugin they do, they have an amazing video for that's narrated by, I think the guy's name is Dan Worrell, who has an amazingly soothing voice. These videos are some of the best videos I've ever seen for describing really complicated functions within their plugins. And there's one that's just dedicated to linear phase EQ. And I'm not going to try and simplify this too much because we'll spend far too much time talking about it otherwise, but effectively the way that it works, it can introduce pre-ringing in bass frequencies. If you use a linear phase EQ to high pass something like a kick drum, you might actually notice you hear the low end swelling into the kick, and that's to do with actually the latency stuff within the DAW. That's latency stuff, that's the technical term. And that's something which, I'm just very wary of doing it. If I'm high passing something quite extremely as a duplicate of something else, that high pass can introduce a really bad phase shift just above the point of the filter. And when you recombine it, you can get some really bad cancellation. That would be the only time I'd use the linear phase EQ. Okay. Again, sponsorship from this company. I'm going to push for it. After this, I better get sponsored. Their EQ, that's kind of my go-to EQ, has different modes. There's a zero latency mode, which is like a regular one, a regular EQ. Between that and linear phase, they have a step called natural phase, which is based more on how analog filters work. And that's a really good in-between. And I use that quite a lot too. But to be honest, most of the time, if you played me a mix and on the overheads, you use natural phase EQ and the same filter shape on that, and then sent me another one with linear phase EQ. Or if you sent anyone that and said, what's the difference? This one's so much better, they'd be absolutely crazy. There's very little to hear in the context of a mix when you're talking about stuff like that.
Okay. How often do you reference back to a commercial mix during the mixing process? Are you toggling back and forth?
I do at some stages.
Okay.
I generally do it to hurt my ego a little bit, because generally by the time you have like a rough mix going, especially before you add vocals, because that always changes everything. But if you've worked really hard on getting a great drum mix and the bass and guitars are rocking too, you can start to really feel like you're nailing something amazing, and you sometimes need to be brought back down to earth. And you have to really fight the urge to listen to a commercial mix and be like, wow, mine sounds so much better, because that's something which I think everyone's fallen into the trap of, and then you come back the next day and realize, no, mine actually just sounds weird. And I was so used to it that I thought it sounded better than everything else. It depends where I am. We're going to be talking a bit in the coming segments about, well, the very fact, like right now, we're mixing, well, actually, I mixed on this laptop last night on those headphones, what you hear right now. And that's not something that's easy to do without references of some sort. So we'll be talking about referencing music, but we'll also be talking about using analyzers, frequency analyzers, to help fill in some of the information that you might not be hearing and make sure that your stuff is not being skewed unduly.